Hello everyone. We'll begin our look into the organization of the body as far as the tissues go. So we'll begin looking at tissue. During our introduction to anatomy, we talked about the fact that we had 4 different types of tissues. And so we had epithelium, connective tissue, muscle, and nervous tissue. And all 4 of those tissues make up the entire body itself. So each one of them has specific cells inside of them that generate a particular function, and they're all working towards that similar function within the cells themselves. So we'll begin with epithelium. Epithelium is one of our more diverse types of tissues that we have. And with epithelium, as I had mentioned in our introduction as well, it lines body surfaces. And so it's looking at a body surface somewhere, whether this body surface is the skin, whether it's inside the digestive tract, whether it's inside the lungs, inside blood vessels, glands. It is lining a body surface somewhere. It doesn't always have to be, in a sense, on the outside of the body per se. When we look at epithelium, it has some defining characteristics with it that we can see when we look at it under a microscope. It's avascular. It has no blood supply running through the actual tissue itself. Although it's avascular, it is innervated. And so it does have nerve fibers and nerve receptors that run into the tissue so that we can have sensation about what is going around that particular tissue itself. It's held down to deeper tissues via a basement membrane. So we have a basement membrane that is kind of the lower aspect or the deepest most component of it. And it has what we call polarity, meaning that it has essentially a beginning and an end. And so that basement membrane that starts out at the bottom, in a sense, as at our, for the polarity, is our basal surface. And then from there, as that tissue grows up and outward, and we have the tissue layer at the other end, we then have an apical surface which ends the other side. And so the portion that is actually out to the free edge here and is touching essentially nothing is the apical surface. This tissue, because it is on a body surface, tends to be highly regenerative. It's quick to reproduce. And so if this outermost portion here becomes damaged in some way, we're going to quickly start to regrow and push up new cells from underneath, and we're going to regrow that tissue. Functionally, because it is on the body surface, depending upon where we find it, it does different jobs in a sense, depending upon where we are. If it's on like the skin, it's very protective, and so it's going to give that protective layer to it. Even all along through the digestive tract, it is protective as well. But in the digestive tract, it also has the ability to allow for absorption, allow for secretion, so we can move things in and out of a portion of the body that is there. If it's things like glands, we have either endocrine glands or we have exocrine glands. The exocrine type of a gland we'll talk about, and this exocrine type of a gland secretes to the body surface itself. So this is going to be things like sweat glands. And then the endocrine glands don't secrete onto a body surface. They don't have a duct. They essentially just kind of ooze out of the tissue itself. And then as they do so, they eventually end up into the bloodstream. So when we look at epithelium, we have to think about it in 2 different ways in a sense. And so the first is, how many layers is it? And so we either have simple epithelium or we have stratified epithelium. If it has a single layer of cells, and so when we look at the cell layer here, it's only a single layer. There's only one cell stacked up there. We have a simple epithelium. As soon as we put more than one cell, and so it doesn't have to be multiple layers here like we have here, it can just simply be 2 cells on top of one another. And so we have our 2 cells, we have our basement membrane down here. That is still a stratified epithelium. And so that tells us half of the story in terms of the name of the type of epithelium that we have. The other half is the cell shape. And so depending upon the cell shape, that's going to tell us about the other half of the story. And so squamous type cells are flattened. And so what we see here in both of these pictures here are squamous or squamous types of cells. they're flattened out. When we look at them under a microscope, they tend to look like they're wider than they are tall. And so these cells are going to be kind of like this. Cuboidal cells, as the name kind of implies, look like a cube or a square under a microscope. Columnar cells are taller than they are wide. And so they have the appearance of a column on them. Certain epithelial cells can kind of congregate together into what we call glands. And so glandular tissue itself comes in the two varieties that we said, either endocrine or exocrine. Endocrine varieties we'll touch on again when we get into the endocrine system. So those ones fall under the endocrine system itself. They don't have any ducts. They basically kind of secrete out into the extracellular space, the space around them. And then their secretions end up into the bloodstream for the most part. Some of them will travel just locally and only go through the interstitial fluid, and so the fluid that surrounds all of our cells. These secretions are hormones, and so they're a substance that's going to go out and affect some other type of a tissue elsewhere. Exocrine glands are going to allow us to secrete out onto the body's surface. And these exocrine glands do have a duct, and so they have a duct that they're going to use to get their secretions out onto the surface itself. And they come in a few varieties as well, depending upon the type of secretions that are there. And so merocrine glands are those that produce kind of a watery type of a secretion. And so we find these in our salivary glands, we find them in our glands that are producing tears that we have. They produce more of a loose kind of a tissue, but it has a lot of proteins in it. And those are typically going to be protective to the body. Apocrine glands are small little glands as well. And these apocrine glands produce a secretion that is found in places like the axillary region. And so they produce the sweat that's going to turn into things like body odor, and so they're feeding the bacteria that are there. But they also are modified a little bit, and they become things like mammary glands. They also get modified and become things like our glands that produce earwax or cerumen. And then we have holocrine glands. Holocrine glands are the ones that are going to give us things like acne. And so sebaceous types of glands are going to have those secretions, and those can then get clogged up and cause us a problem. Depending upon the type of gland that we have dictates whether they secrete the entire product that's there. And so here they have little secretory vesicles, and those little secretory vesicles move out to the edge of the cell, and those get released, and the contents then move out of the duct. Versus where we have the entire cell basically falling apart here, and little fragments of the cell itself are making their way out. In this one, the cells are going to have to divide more often. And so the cells are going to have to reproduce themselves more often, simply because the actual cells themselves are going out with the secretions as well. So we see things in the body where we have different types of secretions themselves. And so we have serous glands. Serous glands we're going to find in places like the digestive tract. We're going to find them in places in terms of in and around our organs. And so we're going to have serous fluid there, providing for lubrication in between the organs moving and things like that. We also have mucus type glands. These ones produce a thicker type of a secretion that's there. And so we have this substance where we have water and a substance called mucin that forms to form this thicker type of a substance on the outside surfaces. And then we have glands that can kind of produce both. And so they can produce either a liquidy type of secretion, or it can start to thicken up when there is mucin present. And these are things like our salivary gland. The glands themselves, because they do rapidly divide, they do sometimes have a problem go on with them. And one of those is what we call Sjogren syndrome. And this is an autoimmune disorder where typically with age, a person's immune system starts to attack the glands themselves. And when this happens, it starts to destroy those glands, and it primarily affects things like the salivary glands and the lacrimal glands for tears. And so they end up with dry mouth and dry eyes. And so you can imagine, in a sense, walking around all day with a mouth that is kind of like you had just slept all night long with your mouth open. It's completely dried out. There's no lubrication inside there. Or like on a hot, windy day, your eyes are getting blown on by the wind, and they're all starting to dry out. And that's pretty much kind of how that ends up being for them. So they need artificial tears. They need to be drinking very often to avoid any kind of sores on their eyes or their mouth. Next up, we have connective tissue. And so connective tissue is very, very widespread throughout the entire body itself. It provides for many different functions within the body, everything from physical protection to helping to hold organs and tissues together, to providing for storage for things like adipose, movement in terms of substances, and so transport. We get all of those different processes occurring within the body itself, and different types of tissues accomplish this. And so, for example, things like transport is the actual blood, and so blood is a type of connective tissue. Connective tissues have a few hallmarks when we look at them under a microscope. One, we see cells, but those cells aren't quite as densely packed together as that of epithelium, so there tends to be a bit more space in between them. There's different kinds of cells. They're generally going to have a fiber associated with them. So we'll have one of three different kinds, either collagen fibers, reticular fibers, or elastic fibers that are going to be there. And in between everything, we have this stuff we call ground substance. And so this is essentially extracellular fluid that is in and around the cells and so on. This ranges everywhere from being literally liquid and very fluid in places like the blood to being very solid in places like the bone. So connective tissues themselves have very varying types of appearances within them. And so we have loose connective tissues. We can also have dense types of connective tissues, and they're going to have fibroblasts inside them. And so we can see the cells inside there. We can also see on this particular slide the different types of fibers. And so we can see kind of the thin, wispy fibers in here. We see elastic fibers. Thicker ones, we see our collagen fibers within those. Next to that one there, we have adipose. And so we see our adipocytes inside there. And so each one of those big circles is an actual cell. And the big open space that is there is the lipids that are inside the vesicles that it has. From there we have things like cartilage. And so here we have hyaline cartilage, and those individual cells are all trapped inside lacunae that are there. And then lastly, we have bone. And so the bone here has our osteocytes on there, all the little black specks, different types of cells in there. And even within each of these tissues themselves, there can be even different types of cells as well. Especially like with bone, we have osteoblasts and osteoclasts also. Connective tissue is another type of tissue that there are a whole host of different types of disorders that go along with it. And so here we have Marfan Syndrome. Marfan Syndrome is an inherited disorder in which it creates an improper gene that codes for elastic fibers that are essentially extra stretchy. And so it tends to affect elastic cartilage and elastic tissue. And so places like the joints are able to be essentially extra bendy. We shouldn't be able to move our metacarpophalangeal joints back to 90 degrees there for them. The big concern, though, with Marfan syndrome is the aorta, because there is elastic tissue inside the aorta, there is the potential that the aorta will eventually rupture. So we'll run through a few different connective tissues themselves. And so areolar connective tissue, one of its hallmarks is that it has all three types of fibers within it. It has elastic fibers, it has collagen fibers, and then it also has the visible reticular fibers as well within it. Very diverse. It's a little bit stretchy, it's a little bit strong. Collagen fibers provide for strength, reticular fibers provide for a matrix of strength, and then a elastic fiber allows for it to stretch out some. Adipose, another widely distributed tissue as well. This one can be found in many different places in the body, serves as a protector, and so it's insulation for the body. It's a cushioner for our organs, things like that, and also stores energy. A type of dense connective tissue that we have is dense regular, and it's regular because all of the fibers that we see here, although they are kind of going in a wave in a sense, but all of the fibers are parallel to one another. They're all going in the same direction with one another, and this gives them tremendous tensile strength. And so where we find them is places like tendons and ligaments, where we can pull on them. They're like a rope, very, very strong. From there we have hyaline cartilage, another strong connective tissue. Hyaline cartilage is going to be almost the equivalent of bone. And so we find it in places like here in the costal cartilage, and so it connects our ribs to our sternum. But it also serves as the precursor for many of our bones. And so when we're developing and when we're younger, our bones have a large amount of hyaline cartilage in them, which will eventually ossify and become the bones themselves. Osseous tissue itself, one of the harder tissues that we have in the entire body itself, has a large amount of matrix, and that matrix is all calcified. And so all of kind of the brownish color that's inside here going in these concentric circles almost look like tree trunks or the circles in a tree. Each one of those is all calcified tissue that's there. And then we have the kind of darker black dots that are inside there, all the osteocytes that are helping to maintain the bone itself. Next up, we have our only fluid connective tissue. This is blood. And so blood does have the cells there. It has a tremendous amount of cells. Almost half of the entire blood tissue is cells. But the other portion is this blank space here, which is all of the matrix. And so this is the plasma of blood. This is where we have our non-living component that makes up the blood itself. Next up, we have muscle tissue. Muscle tissue comes in three varieties. We have cardiac muscle, we have smooth muscle, and we have skeletal muscle. Essentially, when it comes to muscle, its job is to contract. It can contract, and that's it. And so it can, when it contracts, it shortens, but not always. We can have contraction without shortening of the muscle. And muscle comes in also two varieties as far as its control. We either have voluntary muscle, skeletal muscle, or we have involuntary muscle. Both cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are involuntary. We can't control their contractions. So cardiac muscle and smooth muscle both have involuntary in common with one another, but then cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle have striations in common. And so we can see a similarity between all of them in the different types of muscles themselves. But most importantly, skeletal muscle is voluntary. We can control when it contracts and when it relaxes. We'll see that skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle look quite a bit alike. And so here we have skeletal muscle, here we have cardiac muscle. And so the two of them both have striations. They both have all of these little lines going through them. Almost makes it look like it's ribbed or something. It always reminds me of like a worm and kind of the striations that a worm has on it as well. Cardiac muscle, though, has an important difference that skeletal muscle has in that it has these intercalated discs. And so that allows communication in between the individual cells. Smooth muscle is different from the other two entirely in terms of its appearance. It doesn't have any visible striations within it. It's single nucleated, similar to that of skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, whereas skeletal muscle is multinucleated for the types that are there. Smooth muscle tends to be spindle-shaped, meaning that it is thicker in the middle and then tapers down on the ends. And so a smooth muscle looks something like that. And so it has a completely different appearance than that of the other two. From there we have nervous tissue. And nervous tissue, we have our neurons being the primary type of cell that is there. But we also have cells that are glial cells or supporting cells that are going to help with maintaining the integrity of all of those nervous neurons. And so this is our communication. The neurons here, this big neuron with its cell body, and then all of those little, what look like almost like fibers, are its way of, in a sense, touching other cells. Those are going out and communicating with other individual cells out within the nervous tissue itself on there. We find nervous tissue only in the brain and the spinal cord as kind of this condensed area, but then it sends out these little branches are going to go out and communicate into the rest of the body via peripheral nerves. And so these are what go out to the rest of the body, and we find them in the arms and legs. So here we can see the actual individual nuclei of our neurons, but then all these little dark dots here are those glial cells. These are all the supporting cells that we have for our nervous tissue. And they're doing everything to help keep those neurons alive, because those neurons are going to live essentially as long as the body lives. And so they're going to stay there from the beginning of life all the way till the end of life. Another type of connective tissue disorder is lupus, or systemic lupus erythematosus is one particular kind. With this, we tend to see a preponderance of women that are diagnosed, and so it is far more females than that of males that become diagnosed with lupus. It causes inflammation in and around the organ systems themselves. And so where we have things like the skin, in deep to the outer layers of the skin, we have connective tissue as well. And that connective tissue, when it becomes inflamed, we start to see it on the surface as being all red. The concern with lupus is that it will eventually attack the organs themselves inside. And so kidney failure is one of the top leading causes of death. Developmentally, connective tissue starts out very early on in terms of its differentiation into one of three types of germ layers, either ectoderm, mesoderm, or endoderm. And so these three types of germ layers develop, and they're going to develop into then all of the different types of tissues that we have. And so we're going to have some that are more geared towards one versus the other. And so ectoderm becomes nervous tissue. So we'll see that ectoderm primarily becomes the nervous tissue itself. I'm just going to jump ahead to this slide here. And so we have ectoderm out on the outermost aspect here as being our nervous tissue. From there we have our mesoderm, and the mesoderm here in the middle, as the name kind of implies, meso-middle. This becomes a large amount of our muscle and connective tissue. And then the one that kind of doesn't follow the rules, so to speak, is epithelium. Because epithelium is so diverse in terms of the types that we have many different kinds of developmental aspects for them, and they really come from all three different layers. And so we'll see them in each of the three layers themselves, and depending upon whether it came from ectoderm, mesoderm, or endoderm, dictates the fate of those particular types of cells that are there. And we'll continue on the next time.